Welcome to The Exchange, a series of rounds to drive change. Our session has been co-developed with Interior Health and the Canadian Medical Association and was planned to achieve scientific integrity, objectivity, and balance. We would like to acknowledge and recognize that our work occurs on the 7 unceded, ancestral, and traditional First Nations territories where we live, work, learn, and collaborate together. We would also like to recognize the Métis Nation BC, in particular the contributions of the Métis people to the diverse Aboriginal landscape of the interior. For information, privacy, and security, the exchange sessions will be recorded and shared publicly. Presenter and facilitator names will be shared. Attendee names will not be published, although voices will be recorded during the question and answer portion of the session. Those attending and applying for CME credits, names will be shared with UBC CPD and the Canadian Medical Association for attendance verification only, and will not be used or shared for any other purposes. When we come to the questions session, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, as well as the chat function. You may also raise and lower your hand. My name is Dr. Harsh Shandal. I am the Executive Medical Director for Physician Engagement. Our guest today is Dr. Doug Cochran, IH Board of Directors Chair. Dr. Cochran has no financial disclosures to make. To define the objectives, to be able to describe the concept of implicit bias, reflect on your own thinking. How have your own biases influenced your relationships in the practice setting? And how will you make the unconscious conscious? So I turn over the session to Dr. Cochran on unconscious bias.
Thanks very much, Harsh, for the opportunity to join with you in the X-Exchange rounds. It's indeed a pleasure for me to do so, and to do so from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Silk Nation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging some major contributions to my understanding, not of this topic specifically, but of safety in general, and how biases influence patient safety as well as racism. And I'd acknowledge Pat Crosscarry and Charles Vincent as models whose academic work I follow diligently. Daniel Kahneman, you will hear referenced during the course of the presentation. And for those of you who are elderly, you'll remember James Reason, who passed away this past year, Jens Rasmussen, and Glenn Regier, who still resides in the Department of Surgery at UBC. I'd like you to take a few minutes to imagine the following scenario. And it may help to close your eyes, it may not, but we're before COVID. You've been asked to be an external reviewer for the determination of the next head of surgery at the University of Alberta. And you're living either in Kamloops or Kelowna, and there's one final flight. It's about 4:30 in the afternoon. And of course, you've been dealing with paperwork and so on, so you're rushing now to the airport. You manage to get yourself through security, which in Kelowna, of course, is a big deal, finally on the airplane. And as you duck to get into the Jazz aircraft, the pilot is standing there at the door and says, "Welcome. We're pleased to have you join us on this flight." And you go and have a seat, and the flight goes well, and you get to Edmonton, and you actually find a cab to get you down to downtown, and the University of Alberta puts you up at the Sutton Place Hotel. And so you have the opportunity for dinner, because your meeting about the headship search is the following day. And while you're at dinner, you're sitting there on your own. You've done all your emails, and you're listening to the conversation that's occurring around you. And that conversation is from two people who are obviously talking about a 25th wedding anniversary. and the joy and the fun that they've had during the course of their time together and what they're looking forward to in the future. So Sutton Place has nice linen and the beds are comfortable and you have a good restful sleep. You've actually also had the opportunity to go through the curriculum vitae of the 3 individuals who are applying for this role. And you have a pretty good idea of sort of how you'd rank them, even before you walk into the meeting room for the interviews. And when they do that, the chair of the interview committee provides photographs of these individuals so that you could understand who you're going to actually meet. So as you think about these 3 events, one coming onto the plane, one having dinner, and one sitting in a review committee, I wonder how many of you had an image of the pilot that is this one. Now, I'm sure the pilot would not have had the headset on, but may well be an Air Canada person on a Jazz flight. How many of you had the mental image of the couple having their 25th wedding anniversary at the Sutton Hotel who look like this? And how many of you would have even considered an individual applying for the head of surgery job at the University of Alberta or UBC or anywhere else who might look like this? And the person I'm speaking to specifically is the individual, the woman sitting in a wheelchair. I think what you just experienced was the impact of System 1 thinking, cognitive bias. What we will talk about is implicit bias. And for those of you that have read anything from Daniel Kahneman or indeed others, as time has gone by, you'll recognize a process called dual process thinking, System 1 and System 2. They have unique characteristics. You know, I think we all like to think of ourselves as rational individuals, that we are thoughtful, that we put together, we balance probabilities in a way that is effective for problem solving and living our lives. We're conscious about our decisions that we make. But in reality, most of our thinking is actually what has been termed System 1 thinking. And it's interesting to me that actually this kind of dual process thinking is actually quite old. Thomas Paine is quoted in 1794 as saying, any person making observations on the state and the progress of the human mind cannot but have observed that there are 2 distinct classes of what are called thoughts. Those that we produce by ourselves, by reflection, and those that bolt into our mind of their own accord. System 2 and System 1 thinking. The intuitive approach, the System 1 approach, which is fast and automatic and associative, it's unconscious and it tends to be error prone, actually involves the use of heuristics and introduces the problem of bias. So it's intrinsic to us that we have a way the mind is designed, the way we think, that creates bias. And bias can be of 2 types. So it can be conscious, it can be overt, it can be unconscious, and the focus of today's discussion is unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is a reflection really of ingrained habits of thought based on prior experience, assumptions, interpretations, how we're raised, the social context, what we've been exposed to in our schooling, and so on. And it tends to lead to errors in how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. You'll be aware of this as some of the education that's gone on in our medical schools now actually focus on the kinds of unconscious biases that result in diagnostic error. Importantly, though, unconscious bias creates blind spots in our rational decision making. And that's where we see errors in diagnosis or errors in treatment planning. Next. Daniel Kahneman, who of course got a Nobel Prize for his thinking around how we think, the meta-analysis of thinking, described the brain as a machine for jumping to conclusions. I think reflecting the fact that system one thinking occupies far more of our activity and our unconscious energy than does system two. Unconscious bias has been described in a variety of different ways, but there's a researcher in cognitive psychology by the name of Stanovich who described 4 types of system one thinking, the kinds of processes that we see resulting in bias. The first are hardwired evolutionary processes, and we see this in diagnostic anchoring and the availability heuristic that results in diagnostic error. There are clear emotional processes and these are the reactions to patients' behavior or their appearance that influence how we treat them and how we see them. There are a whole group of unconscious biases that reflect overly learned processes. And as a surgeon, surgery is the best example of something that over time is overly learned and becomes automatic. And then there are implicitly acquired processes. These are from our background. And I would suggest in medicine from the hidden curriculum to which we expose our students and our trainees. Now, I'm not a learned student of psychology by any means, so I'll just simply represent implicit bias, as did Stefanovich, as a subcategory of unconscious bias. So what then is implicit bias? Well, in contrast to other forms of biases, implicit bias is never neutral. It requires and forces us to make a judgment about individuals or groups of people, to show a preference for or an aversion to individuals or groups. And it's based entirely on the attitudes that we have to people or the associated stereotypes that we learn about them, and they become unconscious to us. They reflect our cultural and social experiences. A good example actually is the school teacher or the guidance counselor who says to a child, you will never be able to do such and such because of your appearance, your race, your disability, the fact that you're left-handed, whatever. And they become ingrained in a way that they become manifest during the times when we're using type 1 thinking processes. Now, if we're going to create an alignment, implicit bias is not neutral, there's a preference or an aversion, we then come to the establishment of groups. Next slide. And what implicit bias does is it allows us to sort people into 2 sort of groups. There's the group that we like to be associated with because they represent who we are. We've been surrounded with them all our lives. We've learned from them. And through our development, we've understood the cultural values of that group. The in-group, the people that are like us, are often those in power and the ones that we wish to emulate. The out-group, the other group, is actually those who are different from us, those who are unfamiliar to us. And if you think about the human condition, we actually quickly pattern match. We automatically categorize people and events and circumstances according to social and other characteristics that are a fundamental quality of our mind. It helps us give some resolution to the complexity of life. I mean, it helps it differentiate friend and foe. Perhaps there was an evolutionary reason for this happening, but it also, if it's left unchecked, easily leads us to, at best, lazy stereotypes and at worst, discrimination and prejudice. The foundation for implicit bias is something that psychologists have termed the self-fulfilling attribution bias. And this is a tendency that individuals have, I have, you have, to attribute the behavior of others to internal characteristics, to their character, to their morality, and to attribute our own behavior to environmental or external causes. This results in something that I think is really quite profound. Next slide. We view others, in the context of this bias, as having flaws of character to account for their behavior. So the individual who's rushing down Harvey Street or Pandozzi Street to actually get to the Kelowna General Hospital is probably thought by many people to be a jerk. He's driving fast, he's cutting in, he's honking, and so on. But in fact, maybe he's taking his wife for delivery and she's now in the late second stage. Whereas we think of ourselves as being somewhat moralistic, we are controlled by other external circumstances over which we have little control. This immediately creates a hierarchy between me and thee. Next slide. And so if there are external reasons, I have a sense of psychological security. If I view someone else as having internal reasons, they actually have faults of character. And the consequence of this is that we are far more forgiving of our own behavior and less so of the behavior of others. The in-group, the out-group. You are different than I am different than you. Now, it isn't just race, actually, that surfaces here. There are many issues, gender, sexual orientation, education, employment, that can be associated with and or trigger implicit biases that result in differences in communication and our treatment of others and our patients. And if you think about your clinic, if you add to this obesity, mental illness, homelessness, poor personal hygiene, the foundation is laid for implicit biases to surface and to result in what are termed affective biases, one of the many causes of diagnostic error. Different attributes of a particular individual can trigger different stereotypes. So the context in which you're seeing a patient is really, or an individual is really important. Is it race? Is it gender? Is it the sports team they play on? Is it the Super Bowl individuals who are, on the line and would then be different and treated differently when they're driving home? What does a person do for a living? So implicit biases can be triggered in many ways, and they can be impactful in so many ways. I'd like to propose to you that in the context of all of us, implicit biases exist in the context of our worldview. Not the worldview perhaps represented in this diagram. I think, many worldviews have similar components, but how we see people inside the human being part can actually be very different and influenced by our worldview. So implicit bias actually lies as the underlying stratum, the foundation of the model that Mary Ellen Trappel-Lafon articulated in her reports in plain sight. Implicit and explicit biases resulted in the effects of colonialism and the change in healthcare that was provided to Indigenous people. Implicit bias on the part of individuals are what was seen in the stereotypes that were found in her report. And those, of course, were specifically queried for during the course of the report, but they are so typical. They can be understood, they can be articulated, and they can be seen. And of course, the stereotypes, which are a reflection of, unfounded beliefs or typical beliefs of groups of people, then result in discrimination. And the forms of discrimination that have occurred are also articulated so beautifully in this report. So I guess my posit is that implicit bias underlies, through the creation of mental images and stereotypes, the foundation upon which discrimination, either for good or for ill, occurs. And then the consequences of that we see in our Indigenous population through limitation to access and poor health outcomes. Going back to the implicit definition that we talked about a little earlier, and the fact that it implies and it creates an in-group and an out-group, it really is based, the challenge, I think, of implicit bias is based on the suspicion of the unfamiliar. So the question then becomes, what can be done about suspicions of being unfamiliar? And I'm indebted to Valerie Alexander, who has a TED Talk, who helped me understand what I as an individual could do to address the issues and the behaviors that I think underlie prejudice and discrimination that are dependent on implicit biases. There are two primary approaches that I think are important to think about as an individual to reduce stigma and prejudice at an individual level. The first is to reduce the activation of whatever that implicit stereotyping might result in. And the second is to change the perception of others by purposefully restructuring your thoughts. So in the first circumstance, if you happen to walk into your office and you had a slightly dirty individual sitting in a corner, muttering to herself, someone you didn't know, and it was a new patient and the nurse or the office staff had said she's come in for a prescription refill, your mental model might have immediately jumped to what was the prescription that this person needed. Therefore, was it in fact narcotics, and therefore was this person drug seeking, and therefore was this person here to manipulate you? When in fact, the prescription refill was for an antihypertensive. And it was a new patient to the community and a new patient to your practice and a new patient to you. The second approach is to actually think about what your own behaviors would be. Like, would I handle this circumstance if the person looked like me? We're so visually informed in our world that the appearance of one to another is really, really important. So would I treat this person differently if she did not look like me? And I'll leave you with a reference to Mary Ellen Trappel-Lafon's report where she describes in vivid detail the experience of a First Nations person having a physical examination by a urologist, and the urologist not understanding, appreciating, or even considering the fact that this person was being treated differently than he or she would treat anyone else. The other thing that's really interesting, and the chief of surgery example is I think, a really good one. Can you make things that have been unseen in the past unseeable, or unseeable in the future. In other words, you know, it's now possible that the head of surgery could actually be someone who was working from a wheelchair, who may have had a congenital malformation that had led her into surgery, and that she was so successful in the worlds of academic medicine to be considered as the primary candidate for that role. The best example, the one that Valerie Alexander gives, is that of a Black president in the United States. Prior to Obama's election, no one would have imagined a Black president. After Obama's term, no one could not imagine a Black president, or in today's world, a Black vice president. And for those of us who are pretty simple people, having a big coffee card and taking people to dinner, taking them to coffee, is perhaps one of the most effective debiasing activities we could do. It's getting to know people and it's understanding them. So this is really, the strategies are about making the unconscious conscious. This is hard work at an individual level. It's really hard when you're tired and exhausted, when your family's on the rocks, when you are struggling with COVID, when you're fearful. But it is something that people learn to do. And I'll give you a very clear example. A number of years ago, Glenn Regier and Carol Ann Moulton, when they were in Toronto, did a study of surgeons. And the study was around what surgeons did when the going got rough. So when they ran into something that was unexpected. And the thesis, the observation was that things slowed down. They shifted from system 1 thinking to system 2 thinking. They took more time to do that. They put the issue in context. They used their staff better. But it took more mental energy. It was harder to do that. And yet that's exactly what we do when we have a diagnostic dilemma, when we have a surgical dilemma. So we actually know how to do this. I think it's really a question of doing it and supporting each other to do it. This is an interesting randomized trial of the use of conversations to influence the pattern of voting in Florida. The issue, they had an issue on the ballot which related to transphobia. And I think the trans community recognized that there would be very little uptake in a positive way to support this particular initiative. So a group of researchers, this Brockman and Calla, I mean, it's really quite amazing. They set out a randomized controlled trial, and what they did were home visits to people in community, random people in the community. And so they went to the door and they knocked on the door and they said, we'd like to talk to you about, Article 49 on this year's ballot. It relates to the rights of trans people, and we'd like to give you some information about that. So one group got the information. The other group got the information, plus were asked a question. They were asked about a time when the individual, the person being the homeowner or the person being asked the question, when they themselves had been judged negatively for being different. The researchers then went back. I don't think they had a way of tracking how people actually voted, but they went back 3 months later and asked the question, asked some probing questions around the attitude to the particular trans issue that was in play. And those that had had the conversation, that had put the trans issue in the context of themselves being negatively judged for being different, held very positive views on the trans issues. And those that did not have that conversation, that particular framing, did not have those issues at 3 months. So Mary Ellen Trappel-Lafond has echoed cries for people to call out racist behavior, to call attention to racist behavior. And since racism is an implicit bias, actually very few of us would even be aware that we are in any way seen to be racist. However, we can see it in others. And having conversations with others about this can have lasting impact on one's own behavior and one's own interaction with individuals. You know, physicians generally, all of us feel that we're above average. You know, I don't know anyone who is, you know, below average in my medical class. But we are as equally vulnerable to biases as anyone else. And yet there are things we can do about them. We're addressing them in our day-to-day life in different contexts. And we can do it by supporting our colleagues. I think this is one of the only ways that we're going to address issues of racism and discrimination. Thanks, Harsh. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Doug. That's a wonderful talk, and brought a lot of ideas together. If you have questions, please use the chat function, the Q&A function, and I'll put your hand up and I'll connect you to Doug. Doug, the particular example, the trans study, to me at least, talked about the power of actually empathy. Until you yourself realized, it's a question that's not really a question, more of a comment, is that often we're unaware of our impact on others. And perhaps the question I have is, how do you call someone out without them going into the defensive mode?
Well, one of the comments that came through in my reading is that, you know, there's really no point in getting defensive about this because it's behavior you didn't actually understand you had in the first place and you weren't aware of. So it's a bit of a flippant answer, perhaps. I do think that if you had an observation and you framed the conversation about that event in the context of, you know, why did it make sense for you to take that particular approach? You're going to engage with people at a different kind of level. It won't be, gee whiz, that was a racist comment and leave it at that. It will be, why did it make sense for you? This takes me back to the patient safety era. You know, we have in patient safety a very strong hindsight bias.
Right.
But if you ask the question of why it made sense, then you open the door to having a conversation about why it may not have affected people in the way you thought, or even bring to your attention that you actually affected people. I can remember too many occasions, actually, as a surgeon giving news to families where I could be very technical and straightforward about the condition of their child, but it's not information that was helpful. And I think the same thing applies to comments that can be interpreted as being inhumane or racist or stereotype.
And how do you think, as an organization, we can support this? There's often how can I put it? There are power dynamics at play sometimes in these situations. How do we as an organization put forward the message that have this conversation? It's important.
Well, you know, I have the opportunity to respond to complaints that come through our patient care quality office. Mm-hmm. And I would like to believe, you can cross-check this with other people on your senior leadership team, but I'd like to believe that the the wording that is going out in responses and the willingness to now meet with people face to face is very different than it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago.
Right.
So as an organization, I think what we can do is take number 2 from Valerie's list of actions, which is, would I treat this issue if that person was me or was my family? And if the answer is I'm treating them differently, that's probably something I need to reflect on. And so the letters are coming out with a different tone. The letters are coming out with an opportunity to actually meet with people and to talk about the issues and so on. And in fact, in the work on our First Nations, with our First Nations communities at our Partnership Accord leadership table, as we in Interior Health revise the complaint process, one of the things that will happen is that we will have more open and I think more humane conversations about why things happen from different perspectives. And you know, Harsh, I think the only way to do that is to actually bring the complainant into the conversation. You never get it out of a piece of paper in a letter.
Absolutely agree with that, and that's why patients, individuals need to be at the table with us, or have that conversation, have that talk. Noreen asks, do you think training physicians about unconscious bias awareness may be more effective than racial or Indigenous education, or do they go hand in hand?
Oh, I think they absolutely go hand in hand. I think, you know, if we go back to that model that Mary Ellen has provided, I think for those of us who never understood the impact of colonization and never understood the impact that medicine had in the colonization process, I'm not just thinking smallpox and blankets, I'm thinking of Indian hospitals and other things. We need to have that background. That is part of the history that was written out of the history when I was growing up. So we need to know about it. And we need to know what the impact of that has been. You know, you could imagine in a different context a child going to a guidance counselor, for example, and being told that, gee whiz, because you are having difficulty reading, you will never be able to do this. You'll never be able to go to university. You'll never be able to be successful. So you might as well stay in where you are. That is your place. And if you hear that often enough, I think people would begin to believe it. So I think we need to sort of provide we need to rewrite history as history would have occurred. And I think there are enough people who remember how history occurred. Mm-hmm. And then I think we need to understand how we think ourselves, because our own biases and how they're affected by our workplace environment and our stress levels and our exhaustion and so on actually do play out in the minds of others. And it reminds me of a comment that I forget who the author is, but someone I'm sure on the chat will tell me. But, you know, people will remember how you made them feel. They will forgive you for what you have done to them. Angela Maya's Maya Angelou. It was actually the author of that statement. And I think it is so profound. We tend to ignore how people feel. If we understood how people felt, we would not be having a discussion about implicit bias. But we need to start somewhere, Harsh.
You got to start somewhere.
And some of us are still young enough to try and to think and learn about this kind of thing.
So, Doug, Kathleen asks, how would you open this conversation with a group of your colleagues or individuals who don't have a background in unconscious bias?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Pat Crosscarry was one of the members of the board of the Patient Safety Institute many, many years ago, and that's how I got to know Pat. And what Pat has done for emergency medicine has written a book called the Cognitive Autopsy. And it largely focuses around clinical examples of where different forms of cognitive bias have gotten in the way of diagnostic accuracy, and, where people have been treated inappropriately as a result of the bias, not necessarily because of a lack of knowledge. And so I guess the unconscious bias thing begins with what we do every day. So maybe the conversation begins with, where have I, tell me a little bit about your practice and how does that practice work? And does my practice treat people like I would want them to be treated myself?
Absolutely. One of our attendees comments that our medical education system is very much about creating unconscious competency within the way we work, quick decisions, decision trees that get in algorithms that get embedded. And they say, how is this work to be done still in our training programs and the use of these algorithms?
Sorry, Harsh. The answer is there are algorithms, and
right.
They exist in every one of our computer systems. And the intrinsic bias against Indigenous people, or the assumptions about their behaviors, are actually in the order sets that we create in our information systems. Right. So whoever said that is absolutely right.
And the other part of this is that bringing this training into our training programs to become more aware of, how can I put it? When you told the pilot story, the assumption of what the surgeon looked like, I think that actually plays out in medicine quite often in terms of this type of specialist looks like this and this other person we attribute. So challenging that perhaps at the very root of our training systems.
Well, it becomes a bit of a circular thing, right? We pick people for certain kinds of characteristics, and as trainers, we pick people who are like ourselves. Mm-hmm. It may not be so obvious around race, and it may not be so obvious these days around gender, but the way they think and the way they behave are very much like us. And I think that kind of segregation into the I would select them group or I wouldn't select them group leaves us lacking actually in many ways. And I can think of programs at at some of the universities I've attended where there have been fatal flaws in that, where we've actually chosen wrong people. And it's because I don't think we've had a big enough pool to bring people from. And that's the diversity aspect of this.
And looking at the diversity aspect, I think part of it is as well the selectors understanding their bias or the system, picking people like me, quote unquote.
Well, the human resources people have all of these little tricks, right? They play on hiring and all this kind of stuff. But, the comment of, I've read the CVs, I've seen what's on paper, so I knew the gender of the person.
Right.
But I would have no idea of what that person's lived experience was, or I could make no assumptions about it other than they would be like me until a wheelchair rolled in the door. I think there's many things that we can do to broaden our perspective. And I think what's really interesting to me is that we can reframe these biases, right? These were learned in the first place. They were learned at a time when we didn't realize we were learning anything, but we can reframe them. And that's actually the really positive part of it. It takes energy and it takes work, but I'm sure it's like any habit. We just need to keep at it for a bit. It's probably easier than weight loss.
So how do we acknowledge and support our physicians in addressing the moral distress that can occur and the inappropriate humor that can surface when they deal with, quote unquote, these stereotypes in their heads with populations that are under stress. How do we sort of acknowledge their distress, but at the same time help them grow and be able to better support?
Yeah,
That was a toughie.
Harsh, I don't know that I have the answer to that question other than to, um, there's lots of distress in all sorts of aspects of life, and there always has been,
Mm-hmm.
and there always will be. If there's something I can do to help get rid of some of the distress, then I should be doing it. And maybe approaching this kind of problem in a way of awareness and framing could be a way that I can get rid of some of the stress in my life.
Fantastic, Doug. The other question is that there are parts of medicine that are incredibly fast-paced, relying on system one. How do we become more mindful in those interactions, in those environments that system-wise we have created? I'm thinking of the emergency room is one area that decisions need to be made quickly, or felt like there is an urgency on moving people through a system. How do we create mindfulness in the moment?
I guess it depends on the question. I think if we're hiding behind medical decisions that need to be made quickly, mm-hmm. we're making a mistake. So the decisions that result in what Mary Ellen found in her review, the decisions or the implicit biases that put one group versus another and make them substantively different, are actually not the medical decisions that are, do I give this antihypertensive or do I start cardiac resuscitation? They're not those decisions. And those decisions, I don't think we are ever held, they're not viewed as being racist because we're not treating people differently one to another. It didn't matter whether that person came in from the downtown east side to St. Paul's or came in from, Kerrisdale into VGH. That arrhythmia was going to be treated in the same kind of way. So let's not hide behind the medical decisions here. If the medical decisions have been poor, if there in fact have been medical mistakes, errors, and malpractice, they need to be called for what they are.
Thank you, Doug. The one last comment. I think I've gone through all the questions that have been asked. Ultimately, what I take away from your talk is there is an opportunity here to actually reflect and to use others around us to point out our blind spots. So this being implicit bias, we can be incredibly unaware that we're coming across in a certain manner or interacting in a certain way. So there's several opportunities for us is to pause, to ask ourselves what you said, would I treat my mother this way?
Yeah.
Right? And to as well have the opportunity to provide feedback to others to help them become better as clinicians.
Well, I think being open to that kind of commentary is really important. But I think it begins with making the unconscious conscious. And Mary Ellen, in the context of Indigenous racism, gave us a list of things that we can think about.
Thank you, Doug. And with that, we end this session of the exchange. I want to thank you once again for being our guest today. On the screen, you will see the resource links to the CMA Wellness Hub, which you can scan with your cell phone, your smartphone, as well as to look into the IH COVID-19 Hub as well. For the evaluation and for your CPD credits, if you scan the current code or connect through the URL, you'll be able to answer the questions and obtain your UBC CPD credits. I have thanks from multiple physicians for you, Doug, to thank you for having this talk and giving people ideas and concepts that they can not only think about, but they can actually act on.
Well, Harsh, thank you for the opportunity. And I think the medical staff, certainly for IH and here in British Columbia, should know that the highest levels of health authority administration are taking this really seriously. The board chairs have spent a lot of time on this, and I think they are beginning to learn. So this is good. The world will be very different, I think.
We're all in this to build a better world. At the end of the day, we want people to be safe. We want people to have great care, and we want the system to keep getting better. And most of all, we want to acknowledge each other's humanity in this process. So this session of the exchange is recorded and will be posted on the IH YouTube channel. I want to thank our friends from the Lower Mainland who have connected as well to listen to this wonderful talk. And thank you once again. Keep safe, be kind, take a moment to reflect. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for watching The Exchange, a series of rounds to drive change. The Exchange is a collaboration between Interior Health and the Canadian Medical Association.